What would you do if the only thing proving you're not a murderer was in the wallet of the man who drove you to your doom? In the darkest corner of Central Park, under the cold New York drizzle, Sarah, a homeless woman forgotten by the world, finds a crocodile leather wallet worth thousands of dollars. But instead of finding money, she finds a ghost of the past, a photograph of a newborn baby with a highly unusual, five-pointed star-shaped birthmark on its shoulder. In an instant, Sarah realizes she hasn't just found a luxury wallet. She has found the key to a shocking kidnapping 30 years ago, a catastrophic case that transformed her from a prestigious pediatric nurse into a reviled monster in the public eye. Why would a powerful billionaire be willing to sell his own flesh and blood? And how could a homeless woman overthrow a financial empire with just an old photograph? Prepare your tissues and do not take your eyes off the screen, even if only for a second. Because what you are about to witness is not just a story about wealth and poverty, but the greatest rise of truth from the ashes of injustice. This truth will make you shudder and ponder what destiny truly is. The autumn of New York City did not arrive with a gentle golden hue. It fell like a heavy, iron curtain. By late November, the bustling metropolis had completely surrendered to a persistent, bone-chilling drizzle that enveloped the soaring skyscrapers in a dreary, gray shroud. To the millions of tourists who flocked to the city every year, New York was a dizzying kaleidoscope of neon dreams. The blinding, electric current of Times Square, the opulent window displays of Fifth Avenue, and the theatrical romanticism of Broadway. But to Sarah, New York was something entirely different. It was a merciless, architectural labyrinth of soulless concrete blocks, a brutal canyon where icy winds howled through narrow, forgotten alleyways, scraping against the skin like broken glass. Sarah could no longer remember the last time she had felt the simple, dignified warmth of a clean mattress. Perhaps it was in a past life, a life so distant it felt like a fable whispered to a child. In that forgotten existence, she had a full name, a valid social security number, a career, and a reason to smile at her own reflection in the mirror each morning. Now, she possessed none of those things. To the city's indifferent bureaucracy and the millions of hurried commuters who brushed past her, she was not a human being. She was merely the woman on bench number 4, a forgotten ghost anchored to the damp wood of Central Park, existing invisibly in the beating heart of a city that famously never sleeps. On this particular afternoon, the park was a dreary canvas of muted, silent tones. Underneath her tattered, oversized woolen coat, a garment she had salvaged from a donation bin 3 winters ago, Sarah huddled into herself. Her thin, trembling hands, mapped with deep blue veins and cracked by the elements, tightly clutched a transparent plastic bag. This bag contained the entirety of her earthly possessions, a few stale breadcrumbs she had salvaged from a bakery dumpster, and a worn-out, water-damaged phone book with pages so fragile they threatened to dissolve at the touch. She closed her eyes, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw in the thick, humid air, which was a suffocating cocktail of ozone, wet earth, and the distant, toxic fumes of idling yellow cabs on Central Park West. Around her, the world moved in a parallel universe of privilege and wealth. Joggers in high-end athletic gear sprinted past, their breath forming brief plumes of steam in the crisp air. Couples wrapped in cashmere walked hand-in-hand under luxurious, wind-resistant umbrellas, their laughter muffled by the steady patter of the rain. Amidst this vibrant tapestry of human connection and bustling ambition, Sarah existed as a profound, somber silence. She was a monument to human displacement, a shadow that the world had collectively agreed to ignore. Then, the rhythm of her isolation was broken. As Sarah opened her eyes to clear the rain from her eyelashes, her gaze suddenly fell upon the empty wooden bench directly opposite her. There, sitting entirely alone amidst the silver raindrops clinging to the dark wood, lay an object that seemed to defy the grim reality of the park. It was a dark brown, crocodile leather wallet. Its surface gleamed with a deep, rich luster, catching the pale amber glow of a nearby street lamp. The stitching was immaculate, and a small, discreet platinum emblem caught the light under the rain. It was an object of such obvious, unadulterated luxury that it looked completely out of place in this gloomy, neglected corner of the park. Sarah froze. Her breath hitched in her throat. In the unforgiving ecosystem of the unhoused, an object of such immense value was never just a fortunate find. It was a paradox. A wallet like that was either a miracle capable of buying a year's worth of hot meals and shelter, or it was a curse, a trap designed to ensnare someone who already had nothing left to lose. For several minutes, Sarah did not move. The rain continued to fall, whispering against the canopy of bare oak trees. She looked left and right. The pathway was momentarily deserted, the affluent passers-by having hurried toward the park exits to escape the intensifying downpour. Slowly, her feet acting on an impulse her mind had yet to fully process, she stood up. Her steps were hesitant, her old joints aching from the damp cold. She crossed the cobblestone path, her worn shoes squelching softly against the wet leaves. She stood over the wallet. Reaching out a trembling, weathered hand, she picked it up. The texture of the crocodile leather was incredibly supple, the heavy scent of premium treated leather instantly cutting through the damp smell of the park. Its sheer weight suggested it was packed with something substantial. Yet, as Sarah opened the main billfold, she did not look at the stacks of crisp, green $100 bills tucked neatly inside. She did not touch the array of platinum and black credit cards that gleamed from their slots, bearing names of financial institutions she had long forgotten. Instead, a voice from the deep recesses of her childhood echoed in her mind. It was her father's voice, resonant and clear, spoken half a century ago in a modest, sunlit kitchen. Your honor, Sarah, is the only thing in this wretched world that cannot be stolen from you, unless you choose to throw it away yourself. Holding on to that internal anchor, Sarah avoided the currency entirely. Her fingers migrated to the back compartment of the purse, a small, zippered slit meant for personal keepsakes. She slid the zipper open. There was no money inside. Instead, her fingers pulled out a faded, time-worn black and white photograph. It was carefully laminated, though the edges had begun to peel and yellow from age. Sarah looked at the image, and the world around her vanished. Captured in the frame was a sleeping infant, wrapped in a knitted blanket. The photograph had been taken from an angle that highlighted the child's left shoulder. There, etched clearly against the smooth, pale skin of the newborn, was a highly unusual, five-pointed star-shaped birthmark. Sarah's heart tightened with a violent, agonizing spasm. A sharp, electric pain surged from the deepest, most locked-away vaults of her memory, flooding her consciousness with such overwhelming power that her knees buckled. She had to violently clutch the iron armrest of the bench to keep herself from collapsing onto the wet cobblestones. That birthmark. It was not just a random anatomical quirk. It was an identifying feature she knew intimately. It was a fragment of a catastrophic explosion that had shattered her entire existence exactly 30 years ago. The drizzle began to intensify, transforming Central Park into a blurry, impressionistic canvas of bleeding light and dark shadows. The skyscrapers surrounding the park became distant, ghostly monoliths. Sarah stood paralyzed in the downpour, the cold rain soaking through her tattered coat, her trembling fingers tracing the smooth plastic lamination of the photograph. The 30-year-old wall she had built around her past was crumbling into dust, leaving her raw and exposed to a history she had spent 3 decades trying to survive. Because of the roaring symphony of memories in her head, Sarah did not hear the hurried, rhythmic clicking of high heels on the wet cobblestones behind her. She did not see the sharp flash of an expensive smartphone pointed directly at her back. Put it down. Thief! A heart-wrenching, frantic scream shattered the park's silence. Before Sarah could even turn her head, a whirlwind of luxury and fury descended upon her. It was Clara, the elegant, wealthy woman who had been walking through the park moments prior. Clara rushed forward, her face a mask of pure panic and blinding rage. She was wrapped in a tailored Burberry trench coat that cost more than a working-class family's annual food budget. Her immaculate blonde hair was damp, and her beautiful, symmetrical features were contorted with fear. Without waiting for an explanation, Clara violently snatched the crocodile leather purse from Sarah's hands. The sudden, aggressive movement threw the frail, malnourished older woman off balance. Sarah stumbled backward, her worn shoes slipping on the slick leaves, and she fell heavily onto the cold, hard ground. Dirty, freezing water splashed up from a puddle, soaking her white hair and staining the hem of her tattered coat. Look! Look! I caught her red-handed. Clara shrieked, her voice pitching high with hysteria as she turned toward two police officers who had just arrived on the scene. Clara's chest heaved, her voice trembling with a mixture of violation and elite indignation. I was only gone for 5 minutes. I walked to the edge of the path to signal my driver, and I realized I left my purse on the bench. I came back, and this vagrant was rummaging through it. My God, she touched my mementos with those filthy hands. The two officers arrived, breathing heavily, their hands instantly resting on their utility belts. The younger officer, a man with sharp features and an expression of blatant disgust, looked down at Sarah's ragged, muddy appearance. To him, this was a routine nuisance, an open and shut case of a park transient attempting to steal from a wealthy resident. "Get up, old woman," the young officer commanded, his voice cold, devoid of any empathy. He placed a firm, warning hand on his baton. "Don't try to formulate an excuse. Don't try to explain. We're all too familiar with park ghosts like you. You think the rain covers your tracks? It doesn't." Sarah trembled violently as she pushed herself up from the wet ground, her joints screaming in protest. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional tempest raging within her. She wasn't trembling out of fear of the police or the threat of a prison cell. She was trembling because of the photograph. She looked at Clara with cloudy, watery eyes that held an intense, agonizing urgency. "I didn't take your money," Sarah whispered, her voice raspy from decades of breathing in the harsh New York winters. "I didn't touch the cards. I only looked at the picture. That child, that 5-pointed birthmark. You don't understand." "Shut up," Clara shrieked, tears of pure rage breaking through her flawless makeup, leaving dark trails down her cheeks. "You have absolutely no right to mention that child. You have no right to look at him. It is my family's deepest pain, a tragedy that people of your kind could never begin to comprehend. Officers, take her away immediately. I want her processed. I want her jailed. I want to prosecute her to the absolute limit of the law." The older officer sighed, pulling a pair of cold, steel handcuffs from his belt. "Let's go, lady. You're making a scene." Amidst the distant wailing of approaching sirens and the gathering crowd of curious onlookers who had stopped to watch the free drama unfolding in the rain, a suffocating, prejudicial atmosphere enveloped Sarah. The young officer grabbed her upper arm with unnecessary force, pushing her against a nearby stone retaining wall. Her thin, frail wrists were pulled behind her back, and the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked shut, locking her into the role of a criminal. In that single, brutal moment, the collective prejudice of society had pronounced its sentence long before any judge or trial could even begin. Her poverty was her guilt. Her tattered clothes were her conviction. But then, fate intervened with the suddenness of a lightning strike. As Clara frantically opened the crocodile purse to check if her wealth was intact in front of the police, her hands shook so violently with adrenaline that the leather slipped from her manicured fingers. The contents of the open bag spilled onto the wet path. Lipsticks, keys, and compact mirrors clattered against the stone. And from the back compartment, the faded, laminated, black and white photograph of the newborn fell out, fluttering through the air before landing face up in a shallow puddle, right next to Sarah's cracked, bare feet. "Stop," Sarah whispered. The word was quiet, but it carried a strange, heavy resonance that seemed to cut through the sound of the falling rain. The officers paused, momentarily struck by the sudden shift in the old woman's demeanor. Her voice was hoarse, but it possessed an authority that did not belong to a beggar. Sarah looked down at the photograph in the mud, then raised her eyes to meet Clara's furious gaze. "You say that photograph is a family heirloom?" Sarah asked, her voice growing stronger, each word deliberate and piercing. "You claim it as your exclusive tragedy? Let me ask you this, elegant lady. Do you even know the child's true name? Do you know what specific lullabies he needed to hear before he would close his eyes at night? Or do you merely view that baby as a convenient symbol of loss, a tragic accessory you use to embellish your own nobility and play the victim?" Clara froze. She looked at Sarah as if the homeless woman had suddenly spoken in an alien tongue. A deep, instinctual shock rippled through her, and a sudden, terrifying chill ran down her spine, freezing the blood in her veins. There was something in the older woman's tone, an intimate, agonizing familiarity with the subject, that completely defied logic. What did you just say? Clara stepped closer, her expensive coat dragging against the wet bench, her face now only inches away from Sarah's muddy, wrinkled visage. How dare you? That child is my brother. He was stolen from his cradle 30 years ago. My mother went completely insane searching for him, weeping until the very day she died in an asylum. Who are you to question my family's agony? Who are you? Sarah let out a laugh, a hollow, bitter sound that carried the weight of 3 decades of silent suffering. She did not look at Clara. Instead, she looked down at her own tattered, soaked sleeve. With an unexpected, desperate surge of physical strength, Sarah yanked her thin arms upward against the police officer's grip, forcing the fabric of her sleeve to slide backward, exposing her bony, pale forearm and wrist beneath the worn, wet layers of cloth. Under the dim, flickering yellow glow of the New York street lamp, the officers and Clara stared in absolute, paralyzing disbelief. There, etched permanently into the pale skin of Sarah's wrist, was a 5-pointed star-shaped birthmark. It was identical, matching down to the exact millimeter, to the unique birthmark on the baby's shoulder in the photograph. I am not the thief, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper that cut through the November storm like a surgical scalpel. I was the one holding that beautiful child on the terrifying night he was stolen. And you, Clara, do you want to know why your family possesses that photograph? Do you want to know the truth? Because the monstrous mastermind who hired the kidnappers, the man who left me framed, broken, and homeless for 30 long years to cover his tracks, is the very father you have spent your entire life revering. Time did not just slow down, it stopped entirely. The rhythmic patter of the rain on the autumn leaves suddenly transformed into a deafening, roaring symphony of cosmic justice. The 2 police officers stood completely frozen, their hands loosening their grip on Sarah's arms. Clara recoiled as if she had been struck in the face, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Her expensive crocodile leather purse remained face down in the dirty puddle of Central Park water. This time, nobody dared to breathe, and nobody moved. The ticking of the antique clock in the meeting room today suddenly transformed into the incessant sound of rain falling 30 years ago. In Sarah's mind, the modern sounds of New York began to recede, replaced by the phantom ticking of an antique grandfather clock. The cold November drizzle transformed into the ferocious, blinding whiteout of a historic blizzard. It was New York City, January 1996. Sarah was 24 years old. She was a young woman characterized by a radiant, infectious smile, bright eyes full of ambition, and a heart completely dedicated to her calling as a pediatric nurse. She had been hired by the ultra-wealthy Sterling family to serve as the private caregiver for their newborn son, Julian. To Sarah, Julian was not merely a wealthy employer's heir or a paycheck. She loved the 6-month-old infant as if he were her own flesh and blood. Julian was a gentle, angelic baby who possessed a distinct, 5-pointed star birthmark on his left shoulder. He had an endearing habit of tightly wrapping his tiny fingers around Sarah's thumb whenever she sang him a soft, melancholic lullaby about the stars mapping the night sky. On that fateful, cursed night in January, a historic blizzard had completely paralyzed the tri-state area. Gale-force winds whipped against the massive, stone architecture of the Sterling Mansion, located on a secluded, sprawling estate in upstate New York. Inside the warmth of the 3rd-floor nursery, Sarah was gently rocking a restless Julian to sleep, humming their favorite melody. She had absolutely no idea that directly beneath her feet, in the shadows of the wood-paneled library, a far more sinister storm was brewing. Thomas Sterling, the patriarch of the family, a man whom the financial world revered as a brilliant, self-made billionaire, sat across from 2 shadowy, masked strangers. The public image of Thomas was an elaborate, carefully constructed lie. In reality, he was a compromised, desperate man, a bloodthirsty gambler who had secretly squandered his family's multi-million-dollar empire on highly illegal, fraudulent real estate schemes and offshore debts. He was facing imminent financial ruin, public disgrace, and a lifetime in federal prison. Everything is perfectly aligned, Thomas whispered to the men, his voice thick with the scent of expensive scotch and absolute despair. The storm has cut the power lines. The security cameras are completely dead. The baby will disappear tonight. The Lloyds of London insurance policy on his kidnapping is valued at $20 million. It will clear my debts entirely. And as for the blame, we will lay it entirely on the young nurse upstairs. She is an orphan. She has no powerful family, no money, and no social standing. No one will ever take her word over mine. Suddenly, a massive crack of thunder rattled the mansion's windows. Upstairs, Sarah's acute maternal instincts flared. Through the howling of the wind, she heard the distinct, heavy thud of footsteps echoing down the isolated third-floor hallway. It wasn't the soft step of the child's mother. Clutching Julian tightly against her chest, Sarah slipped behind the heavy mahogany doors of a walk-in wardrobe, peering through the slats. To her horror, the door to the nursery burst open. Thomas Sterling stepped into the room, accompanied by two large men wearing black tactical masks. What terrified Sarah to her very core was not the presence of the intruders, but the look in Thomas's eyes. It was a cold, dead, reptilian gaze as he pointed a finger directly at his own son's empty cradle. "Where is the boy?" one of the masked men growled. "He was just here," Thomas hissed, his voice twisted with panic. "Find him. We don't have time." Sarah's mind shattered with realization. The mastermind behind the abduction of the baby was his own father. Knowing she could not fight three grown men, Sarah made a desperate, split-second decision to save the infant. She wrapped Julian in a thick fleece blanket, unlocked the nursery's bathroom window, and climbed out onto the icy fire escape. The freezing wind hit her like a physical blow. Carrying the baby against her heart, her bare feet treading upon the razor-sharp shards of ice and frozen snow, she climbed down into the blackness of the blizzard. She ran frantically into the woods bordering the estate, ignoring the branches tearing at her face and the deep gashes cutting into her bleeding feet. She had only one singular, consuming goal: to protect Julian from the monster who had sired him. But human endurance has its limits against a blizzard and a desperate billionaire. Thomas, knowing the terrain intimately, tracked her footprints in the snow. Near the edge of the frozen river that bordered the property, he caught up to her. Sarah turned, gasping for air, her body shivering uncontrollably, her arms locked securely around the crying baby. "Give me the child, Sarah," Thomas commanded, holding a heavy iron golf club he had taken from his study. "Never," Sarah screamed against the howling wind. "He is your son. How can you do this to your own blood?" Thomas did not argue. He did not hesitate. Step by step, he closed the distance. As Sarah turned to run across the ice, Thomas swung the heavy iron club, striking her brutally across the back of her head. As darkness rushed in to claim her, the last image Sarah saw through her failing vision was Julian being violently snatched from her arms, his tiny hand reaching out into the falling snow. She let out a final, agonizing, heart-wrenching scream before her world dissolved into total blackness. Thomas Sterling did not kill her that night. He understood that a dead body required a murder investigation, whereas a living scapegoat could be used to close the case permanently. Using his immense wealth and political influence, Thomas heavily bribed key officials within the local police department. He fabricated an elaborate trail of forensic evidence suggesting that Sarah had suffered a severe psychotic break, kidnapped the child for a fictitious ransom, and, in her frantic escape through the woods, had accidentally dropped the infant into the raging, icy currents of the Hudson River, where the body was presumed swept away. He transformed her from a silent, self-sacrificing hero into a reviled, deranged child murderer in the court of public opinion. When Sarah finally woke from her coma weeks later, she found herself locked inside a high-security state psychiatric facility. Stripped of her legal identity, labeled a criminally insane John Doe due to amnesia, she was subjected to years of forced, heavy sedation and experimental memory-altering drugs designed to dull her cognitive faculties. By the time she was finally deemed harmless and thrown out onto the unforgiving streets of New York decades later, she was a broken shell of a woman. She was a ghost with a fractured memory, left to rot in the gutters of Manhattan. For 30 years, Sarah lived in a state of perpetual, agonizing exile. She wandered through the city's parks, scavenging for discarded newspapers, quietly watching from afar as the Sterling family rebuilt their empire on the blood of their lost son. She had never dared to seek legal justice. Decades ago, before she was cast out of the asylum, a shadowy operative hired by Thomas had cornered her, whispering a terrifying ultimatum. If she ever tried to speak the truth, Thomas would locate the secret offshore facility where Julian had been hidden away and ensure the boy was executed. To protect the child, Sarah chose the silence of the streets. The photograph in the purse was the only thing Sarah managed to retrieve from Thomas's office before being evicted 30 years ago. It wasn't Clara's. It was her lucky charm, the reason Sarah continued to live through the cold winter nights in New York. The transition from the rain-soaked paths of Central Park to the opulent interior of the Sterling limousine was a surreal, silent journey. Clara, paralyzed by the cosmic revelation and the terrifying alignment of the birthmarks, had ordered the police to stay back. She had looked into Sarah's eyes and recognized a profound, ancient grief that no actor could ever fake. Desperate for the truth, Clara had driven Sarah directly to the Sterling family mansion. The ancestral estate stood isolated on a manicured hill in Westchester, the dim yellow light emanating from its massive, arched windows doing absolutely nothing to diminish its oppressive, gloomy atmosphere. Clara led Sarah inside, crossing a grand foyer lined with towering oil portraits of the Sterling lineage, faces that looked dignified, philanthropic, and noble, but in Clara's eyes, they were now nothing more than grotesque masks of systemic deceit. Thomas Sterling sat alone in the massive, mahogany-lined library. A crystal glass of vintage red wine was held firmly in his hand as he stared intently into the roaring fireplace, his face illuminated by the dancing orange flames. Hearing the heavy doors open, he did not turn around, his voice sounding hoarse and impatient. "Clara, you are exceptionally late. Where's my crocodile wallet? Did you retrieve it from the park? It contains sensitive documents I require for tomorrow's board meeting." "I found the wallet, Father," Clara said. Her voice was trembling, but it possessed a cold, razor-sharp resolution that caused the old billionaire to stiffen. "And more importantly, I have found the living spirit attached to that wallet." Thomas turned around slowly, a look of annoyance on his face that instantly vaporized into pure, unadulterated horror. The crystal glass in his hand slipped from his fingers, crashing violently against the imported Persian carpet, shattering into 100 glittering shards as the dark red wine pooled like fresh blood. Standing directly behind his daughter was not a team of elite bodyguards, but a literal specter from his darkest nightmares. Sarah stood there. Her tattered clothes were soaked, leaving a trail of muddy park water on the pristine floor, creating a stark, jarring contrast against the opulence of the billionaire's sanctuary. But her eyes, once cloudy and defeated, now held the absolute, terrifying authority of a supreme judge. "Sarah," Thomas whispered, the name escaping his lips like an ancient, cursed spell. His face turned an ashen, deathly white. How are you alive? How did you get in here?" "I died once on that freezing, stormy night 30 years ago, Thomas," Sarah said, taking a deliberate step forward. Each squelch of her wet shoe against the carpet sounded like a tolling bell of doom for the billionaire's conscience. "But fate refused to let my soul vanish into the ether until your golden mask was ripped away. Tell me, Thomas, for the past 30 years, have you slept soundly in your silk sheets, building this financial empire on the blood, tears, and stolen life of your own son?" Thomas regained his aristocratic composure with the terrifying speed of a seasoned predator. He let out a harsh, mocking sneer, turning his gaze toward Clara. "You believe the delusional ramblings of a crazy, homeless old vagrant, Clara? She is a convicted kidnapper. She is the psychotic monster who ruined our family and drowned your infant brother. That birthmark on her wrist is nothing more than a bizarre, genetic coincidence. Get this garbage out of my house before I call the authorities." "A coincidence, Father?" Clara yelled, her voice breaking as she violently threw the crocodile wallet and the laminated black and white photograph onto the mahogany desk. "Then explain to me why you have kept this specific wallet locked away like your very life. Explain to me why you legally forbade me from ever uttering Julian's name in this house. And explain to me why." Clara marched forward, grabbing Sarah's thin wrist and holding it directly beneath the desk lamp, right next to the photograph. "Why is this star-shaped mark identical down to the exact angle to the one our mother cried herself to death over, seeing it in her dreams every single night?" Thomas fell completely silent. His lack of an answer was the most definitive, egregious confession he could ever offer. Clara continued, her choked sobs of betrayal transforming into an absolute, righteous rage. She reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a bundle of old, yellowed financial ledgers she had secretly extracted from the mansion's private safe weeks prior. I found the hidden offshore financial reports from 1996, Father. The $20 million insurance payout from Lloyd's of London was deposited into your private Cayman account exactly 4 days after my brother disappeared. You didn't lose a son to a kidnapper. You sold him. You orchestrated the abduction of your own flesh and blood to liquidate his life and save your empty, pathetic reputation. Thomas's face contorted into a snarl. The elegant facade of the billionaire completely vanished, revealing the volatile, ugly creature underneath. He slammed his fists onto the desk, knocking over a brass lamp. I did all of it for this family. Thomas roared, his veins bulging against his neck. I did it for you, Clara, so you could grow up living like royalty. So you could attend elite Ivy League universities, drive luxury vehicles, and hold a position of absolute power in New York high society. Where do you think your pristine life came from? It was built on that necessary sacrifice. That was not a sacrifice, Thomas. It was a monstrous, unforgivable crime. Sarah interrupted, her voice echoing through the vaulted ceilings of the library like thunder. You did not protect your family. You only ever protected your own pathetic, cowardly selfishness. That poor child had to grow up completely severed from his identity, never knowing the warmth of a mother's love, while his real mother died in a padded cell because of your calculated cruelty. Just then, the brilliant, flashing red and blue lights of multiple emergency vehicles illuminated the large library windows. The high-pitched, wailing sirens of the New York State Police blared through the quiet estate. Clara looked at her father with the coldest, most detached gaze he had ever seen in his life. I didn't just bring Sarah here, Father, Clara whispered. Before we left the park, I called Inspector Miller of the State Major Crimes Unit. He has officially reopened the case of Julian Sterling based on Sarah's unsuppressed testimony, the forensic matching of the birthmark, and the financial records I just transmitted to his department. You spent 30 years using billions of dollars to buy back the past, Father, but you can't buy back the truth anymore. Thomas Sterling slumped heavily into his expensive, custom leather executive chair. The towering, intimidating arrogance of the New York billionaire completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing more than a frail, cowardly, and pathetic old man trembling before the crushing weight of his own historical darkness. The library doors were kicked open, and a contingent of armed state troopers, led by a stern-faced Inspector Miller, stormed into the room. Within seconds, the cold steel of handcuffs locked around the wrists of the man who had once signed countless billion-dollar international contracts. As Thomas was being led out of the library in disgrace, his path crossed directly with Sarah's. He paused, his head bowed, unable to meet her gaze. Sarah did not look at him with hatred. There was no fire of vengeance in her eyes. Instead, they held a profound, devastating pity. Money can build the tallest, most glittering concrete towers in New York City. Thomas, Sarah said softly, her words hanging in the air like a final judgment. But all the wealth in the world can never hide the wretched stench of decay inside a corrupted soul. In the months that followed, the flashlights of the global media flickered incessantly outside the steps of the Manhattan Supreme Court. The Sterling family affair had transformed into a massive, psychological earthquake that gripped the entire nation. Thomas Sterling, a man who had once been celebrated as the literal embodiment of the American dream and capitalism, now appeared on the front pages of every newspaper dressed in a bright orange prison uniform. It was a poetic, ironic twist of fate. The uniform was the exact same color as the high-visibility protective vest Sarah had been forced to wear during her decades of performing manual community service on the streets of New York. The legal trials dragged on for months, dominating television screens across the globe. The immaculate paper trail of fraud, combined with the corrupt police records unearthed by Inspector Miller and Sarah's detailed, hauntingly precise testimony, painted a horrifying picture of corporate greed and familial betrayal. The defense tried desperately to argue mental incompetence, but the mountain of evidence was insurmountable. Thomas Sterling was ultimately sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Due to the severity of the charges, all of the Sterling corporate assets, mansions, and offshore trusts were frozen by the federal government, liquidated to pay for victim compensations and massive state fines. Yet, the harshest, most devastating punishment for Thomas was not the iron bars of his cell or the loss of his billions. It was the absolute, suffocating silence. Throughout the entirety of the lengthy trial, Clara never once looked her father in the eye. She legally abandoned the prestigious, blood-stained surname of Sterling, officially reverting to her late mother's maiden name. The legal system had delivered a tangible sentence, but the absolute punishment of total loneliness gnawed at Thomas's soul every single night in his cold, dark prison cell. As for Sarah, her post-trial transformation was nothing short of a miracle born of deep compassion. Clara had completely refused to let Sarah return to the streets, using her own independent inheritance from her maternal grandmother to purchase a beautiful, peaceful, and sun-drenched villa in the quiet suburbs of upstate New York. The home featured a sprawling garden filled with blooming purple lavender, ancient oak trees, and the sweet melody of birdsong every morning. Sarah was no longer the woman on bench number 4. Her days of scavenging through garbage bins for survival were permanently over. She spent her quiet mornings tending to the soil, her hands, once cracked, calloused, and bleeding from the harsh winter elements, now soft, healed by therapeutic creams and the attentive, loving care of private nurses who treated her with the utmost dignity. However, despite her comfortable new life, Sarah still maintained one specific habit. Every Friday afternoon, she would travel back to Manhattan to take a long stroll through Central Park. But this time, she walked with a proud, dignified bearing. Her eyes were no longer cast downward toward the wet cobblestones to hunt for scraps of food or copper coins. She looked directly into the faces of the passers-by, her lips curved into a warm, compassionate smile. She used every single dollar of the multi-million-dollar state compensation she received from her wrongful institutionalization to establish a global nonprofit organization titled The Stars Path. The foundation was strictly dedicated to utilizing advanced DNA technology to locate missing children, while simultaneously providing comprehensive legal defense and psychological housing support for homeless individuals who had been wrongfully accused by a biased legal system. Sarah understood deeply that there were thousands of lost souls wandering the concrete canyons of the world, innocent human beings who merely required a single, compassionate hand extended at the right moment to guide them out of the shadows and back into the light. The ultimate emotional climax of her long journey arrived on a warm, golden afternoon in May, when the spring sun had completely melted the memory of the winter frost. Through the extensive global network and investigative resources of the Stars Path, Sarah and Clara had finally managed to track down the fate of the stolen baby. Julian had been sold through an illegal, underground adoption ring to a well-meaning, oblivious couple in the United Kingdom who were entirely unaware of the criminal masterminds involved. He had grown up under a different name, David. Today, David was a highly respected, 30-year-old professor of classical archaeology at the University of London. Upon receiving the official DNA results and learning the terrifying, beautiful truth of his origin, he immediately booked the first flight to New York. The emotional atmosphere at the John F. Kennedy International Airport terminal was filled with a rich, warm, golden amber tone, a complete, symbolic contrast to the bleak, gloomy gray of the New York drizzle at the beginning of this journey. As David walked through the arrival gates, his eyes immediately locked onto the elderly woman standing next to Clara. As he approached, Sarah could no longer contain the dam of tears she had held back for 30 years. She sobbed openly, her body shaking with pure, unadulterated joy. She reached out her thin, trembling hands, her fingers tracing the fabric of his jacket, gently feeling his left shoulder through his shirt. David slowly knelt down on the hard airport floor, tenderly taking both of Sarah's weathered hands into his own. My entire life, I have always wondered why I possessed this strange, star-shaped birthmark on my shoulder, David said, his voice deep, low, and laced with profound emotion. And for as long as I can remember, whenever I was trapped in a dark place or afraid of the unknown, I would always dream of a beautiful woman holding me, singing a soft, sweet song about the stars guiding me home. Sarah pulled him into a passionate, desperate embrace, a powerful hug that instantly erased 30 years of forced separation, 30 years of freezing blizzard nights, and 30 years of carrying an unjust accusation. "You are finally home, my beautiful Julian," Sarah wept, kissing his forehead. "The stars have finally completed their journey. They have guided you back to me." The story reached its beautiful, permanent conclusion a year later. Sarah, Clara, and David sat closely together on a pristine wooden bench in Central Park, the exact historical coordinates of bench number 4 where the crocodile leather wallet had been dropped. But on this day, the bench was no longer a symbol of isolation. It had been beautifully restored, adorned with a small, polished brass plaque that gleamed brightly in the spring sunshine, bearing an inscription dedicated to the memory of Clara and David's late mother. "For the mothers who wept in the dark, and the truth that brings the dawn." Sarah looked up through the lush, vibrant green canopy of the spring trees, watching the dappled sunlight dance across the faces of the two children sitting beside her, one the daughter of the man who had destroyed her life, the other the boy she had protected at the cost of her own sanity. "There was a time in my life, my dear children, when I harbored an absolute, consuming hatred for Thomas Sterling," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying the serene peace of a calm ocean. "There were nights on this very bench when I wanted nothing more than to see him suffer the exact same freezing misery and isolation he inflicted upon me. But looking at the two of you sitting here today, hand in hand, I have finally come to realize a profound truth. Harboring hatred only ensures that we remain forever trapped in the dark, damp prison of our own past. Forgiveness is never about erasing, excusing, or minimizing the terrible sins of others, my darlings. Forgiveness is a supreme act of courage. It is about choosing to finally free our own hearts from the weight of the monster's crimes." Dear readers and listeners, the dramatic saga of the Lost Soul's wallet concludes here, but its powerful resonance is designed to echo within your hearts forever. Human life is very much like a luxurious, polished crocodile leather wallet. Its exterior surface may be highly finished, pristine, and dazzling to the naked eye. But what truly defines the absolute, uncorrupted value of a human life is never the exterior casing. It is the sacred treasures we choose to keep secure inside: a faded photograph, a painful but honored memory, or an undying, indestructible capacity for human compassion. The unpredictable currents of fate may occasionally conspire to drag your life down into the deepest, muddiest gutters of existence. But how you choose to conduct yourself within that mud will ultimately determine the true caliber of who you are. Sarah consciously chose her personal honor over the temptation of wealth. She chose the agonizing pursuit of truth over the comfortable complacency of silence. And because of that righteous choice, she ultimately recovered the most precious, priceless asset in the entire universe. Not material riches, but absolute peace of mind. Never, under any circumstances, allow yourself to judge the value of a human soul based entirely on their tattered clothing or their displaced circumstances. Because you never know, behind that veneer of poverty might just beat a pure, brilliant heart of gold, holding the miraculous key to your very own truth. If this profound story of justice, sacrifice, and ultimate forgiveness has touched your heart today, please like and share this narrative to help us spread the vital message of global compassion. Please leave a comment reading, "Truth always prevails," in the section below if you firmly believe in the ultimate victory of cosmic justice. Thank you deeply for listening, and we look forward to welcoming you back on our very next journey to uncover the hidden truths of the human spirit. Sarah's story is proof that justice may be delayed, but it is never absent. Behind every homeless person we encounter each day is a life, a pain, and sometimes a great truth waiting to be heard. If your heart has been touched by Sarah's resilience and Clara's courage, please help us spread this message. Press like, so YouTube's algorithm can bring this heartwarming story to more people, so no soul is left alone in the darkness. Subscribe and turn on notifications to become part of the Unheard Truths America community, where we restore honor to those who are forgotten. Leave a comment. If you were in Clara's situation, Would you dare to bring your father to light to get the truth? We would love to hear your thoughts. And finally, don't forget to watch the video about the billionaire who disguised himself as a street sweeper to test his son's loyalty, which is now playing on the screen. It's another valuable lesson about character that you shouldn't miss. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. Remember, kindness is the only language the deaf can hear and the blind can see. Goodbye and see you again on our next journey to uncover the truth.